welcome to this webinar about an introduction to Swedish research funding. My name is Jane Fisher, and I'm a research consultant and the co-founder of Advanced Research Solutions. In the next 13 or so minutes in this short webinar, you are going to learn how to navigate the Swedish research funding landscape and get an overview of some of the key elements that make for a successful funding application. Before we begin, I'll give you some brief background about Advanced. We are a modular contract research organization that is dedicated to helping researchers improve the quality of their research. In our first 3 years as a company, we have already helped researchers prepare more than 60 grant applications. This is more than most researchers will do in their entire lifetime. So we've accumulated a huge amount of experience in this area, and this has been hugely successful. Already, we've helped researchers in Sweden receive more than 150 million Swedish crowns from major funders. This is thanks to our success rate of over 40%, which is more than twice the success rate for a typical VR project grant. We are a small but powerful team of consultants, including myself, a research consultant with more than 12 years of experience in translational research, Sean, our medical writer with more than 15 years of experience with medical writing, and Suzanne, our clinical research consultant with more than 15 years of experience in research in both academia and industry. First, let's look at the funding landscape for researchers in Sweden. In general, there's an inverse relationship between the size of the funding available and the competitiveness of the grant. Sweden is, of course, part of the EU, and researchers here can receive EU funding like Horizon Europe and ERC funding. These grants are generally very large, but also highly competitive. So you are competing with all the best researchers in all of Europe and even beyond in some cases. Some major grant funding from other countries is also available. So for example, you have the Wellcome Trust in the UK or the NIH in the US, which can grant funding to researchers in other countries. Again, here the grant funding amounts are pretty large, but so is the competition, especially since most of the funding does go to researchers within that country. Then we move on to Sweden. The Swedish government has set up 4 research funding agencies. You might have heard of them. We have the Swedish Research Council, or VR, and we have Vinnova, Forte, and Formas. These agencies give out billions of Swedish crowns each year in research funding, and they are highly competitive. The Swedish government has also established research foundations like KK and SSF, which operate quite similarly, but they're a little bit smaller and a bit more focused. Then we come to a unique aspect of the Swedish research landscape, which is the presence of many private funders. These are often focused on very specific fields, for example, cancer or basic life science research. And some of these are highly competitive. They have grant funding amounts and grant funding rates rivaling those of the research agencies. But then you also have many smaller funders, which might give smaller amounts, but they might also be much less competitive, since the applicants are limited to a specific field, so this reduces the possible competition. I highly recommend that you become familiar with the private funders that are available in your specific research field, since getting these smaller funding amounts can be a great way to both supplement your grant funding and also build up your CV when you're early on in your career. Then we come to the regional funds for researchers in a specific region that are given by the region itself. There is usually less funding available here, but you might not have heard about these, and other people probably also haven't. And as you can imagine, when the applicants are limited to only those in one possible region, the possible competition is much lower. So it's well worth checking out your region to see what funding they have available. And finally, we have the institutional funding, where many institutions make smaller funds available for researchers. These are often quite small, but much less competitive, since you're really restricting the competition just to one institution. So you might think of travel grants when you think of these, but many institutions have specific grants available for other purposes, so like a sustainability pilot fund or an innovation grant, which could also be used for your research. As I mentioned, the ERC and VR give out huge amounts of funding, with the ERC giving out over 1.5 million euros and the VR giving out over 1.26 billion Swedish crowns annually, but these are also highly competitive. For example, the ERC has success rates that are below 14% and as low as 10%, depending on the grant scheme, meaning that 86 to 90% of applications to them are just not going to be funded. Likewise, for VR, the funding rates can be quite low, and 86 to 92% of applications are typically not funded. And of course, you would rather be one of the funded applications than one of the denied applications. So let's look at what the applications that fail have in common. Often, they ignore the type of grant and the scope, and submit a project that is not a good fit for the grant call. Also, ever since ChatGPT exploded on the scene, we're seeing a lot more reliance on AI, both for writing and for grammar and coherence checks. And as you know, AI can often hallucinate and introduce errors and inconsistencies, which can obfuscate the message and make an application less fundable. And finally, non-funded applications also often ignore best practices in the field, which are increasingly being evaluated by funders. So you, of course, don't want to be one of these applications that fails. So let's talk about how you can make sure that your application is successful. So the first thing that you want to do is to make sure that you align your application with the scope of the grant call. So you need to look at whether the grant is more focused on an innovative research project or a more practical research project. Some grants, they require really cutting-edge, high-risk, high-reward, innovative projects. For example, the ERC is very well known for this, but also the VR project grants are also geared towards this type of research, where they really want something that is cutting-edge and pushing the boundaries of the field. Other grants, they want a more practical research with a clear feasibility that just builds on previous work. So a different VR grant, like the VR clinical study grant, is one of these that wants a really clear, feasible, and practical project. The worst thing that you can do is to submit an incremental project to one of those who wants a cutting-edge and innovative research project. So an example of this would be if you were to submit a dose-finding experiment for a therapeutic that already has a known effect in preparation for a clinical trial to one of these VR project grants. You will definitely then get the feedback that the project is simply incremental and the project simply won't be funded. But if you do the opposite, then it's equally bad if you submit something really novel and high risk to a grant that has a really high focus on feasibility. So you'll scare the research funders away. They'll say, no, this project simply isn't possible, and they also won't give you the funding. So it's really important to know which type of grant you are applying for. And it's not always obvious from the grant call, and you might not know until you actually try submitting the project, and then you get rejected and you get feedback. So here it's really good to ask someone with previous experience, like a colleague or a consultant. The next thing is to make sure that you're really clearly communicating your ideas in your proposal. Now, normally when you're communicating with someone, like talking or through text, they can communicate back to you, right? They can ask questions, they can get clarification to understand what it is that you want to convey. But when you submit a grant application, you're also trying to communicate your project to the grant reviewer. And like any other type of communication, there's a good chance that they're going to have questions about your project. The problem here is that after you send in your proposal, they can't communicate with you anymore. You have to imagine that you are having a one-sided conversation with the reviewer. They can't ask you questions to clarify things. So that means that everything that you wrote in your grant application is all the communication that you have available. So if they have questions, instead of being able to ask you like they would in a conversation, they turn to the only source of communication they have from you, which is your proposal. So that means that you need to make sure that your proposal contains all of the information that they need in order to be able to evaluate it and anticipate any questions that they might have about your project and answer them within the proposal. So this is a pretty tricky task. It's like expecting you to read the mind of the reviewer. And this is something that's pretty hard to do without having the experience of doing a lot of grant applications. So if you're early in your career, you might find this quite tricky to do. And now the final key point is to make sure you're really using the best research practices in the field. Grant funders are increasingly requiring researchers to include certain research practices that weren't that widespread even just a few years ago. And you might not have learned these from your mentor because they taught you to do things, the way we always did them. But the world is changing, and some of you might remember the reproducibility crisis. It was more than a decade ago. It triggered an increased focus on research quality and defining best practices. There's a whole field now of meta-research that's dedicated to critically examining how researchers are actually conducting research. And it's actually changing how research is communicated and addressed. So if you try to do things the way we always did them, you are going to fall behind. The field is changing rapidly, and so you have to keep on top of new developments to see what is required. And it might not be the same as what was considered standard practice just a few years ago. One example here is open science, which you might have heard about. Just a few years ago, people were arguing so much about whether open access publications and open research data were a good thing. And nowadays, the vast majority of publications are open access, and it is required by most journals to have a statement about data availability. And funders like VR require you to have a data management plan. So here at Advanci, we have a program to support early career researchers. And for a fixed price, you can send us one document up to 6,000 words. This can be either a grant application or a manuscript for submission to a journal. And you will get up to 8 hours of 2 of our expert consultants who will give a critical review of your document and give you scientific advice, and if there's time, also some suggestions for language editing. And this can help you improve your application. So another thing that you can do to get help with your grant proposals is to join a community of other early career researchers. That way you guys can support each other, read each other's grant applications, give each other tips and tricks, and just keep each other motivated. We do have one community of researchers here that you could join if you want to learn a bit more about reproducibility, best research practices, and open science. And that is the Reproducibility Journal Club, which is focused on biomedicine and is based in Lund. And together we have discussions, learning to implement good research practices, and improving research quality. And we meet both online and in person at Medicon Village in Lund, and you are very welcome to join us. So today you got an overview of the research funding landscape in Sweden and learned about 3 key elements that are essential for a successful grant application. At Advanci, we know that early career researchers often need extra support when it comes to securing funding, and that's why we're committed to developing more on-demand webinars like this one, which are designed to help you move forward in your career faster and more effectively. We have several additional on-demand webinars coming up, including topics like getting funding for different types of studies and projects, statistical reporting guidelines in top-tier journals, and digital tools that can help you elevate the quality of your research. I look forward to seeing you guys there. And make sure to follow us and check your inbox for updates so you don't miss another webinar. Thank you guys for watching. If you have any questions or suggestions, please don't hesitate to reach out by email or add me on LinkedIn and send a message. I'm always open to new connections and conversations about science. And remember, academia can be tough, but you're not alone. We're here to support you, advancing science together.